close and personal a physical beating. Most of us have never seen one. I've really only seen one. It sickens me to this day. I was in high school. I was in a hallway, and a kid who was standing by his locker, just a few lockers away from me, was standing there with his books, and a senior, big guy, bully guy comes by, and he humiliates this guy standing by the locker. He knocks the books out of his hands and starts screaming at this kid, "Pick them up, pick up those books." While the kid bent over to pick up the books, he started calling the kid terrible names, mostly questioning his masculinity and making observations about his mother and his mother's ancestry, if you know what I mean. So when the kid collected his books and he stood back up, this bully guy wound up. I'll never forget this as long as I live. And he started throwing punches at the face of this kid who was smaller than I was. And I can still hear the sound of that fist breaking the nose and smashing the teeth of that kid. I can still see the blood splattering on the back of the brown locker and on the terrazzo floor. And all of this happened so fast, I was just caught off guard. And then some other guys came and pulled the bully off this other kid before he was killed. I'll never forget that. It sickens me to this day. Beatings are tough to watch. You never forget the sights and the sounds and the terror involved. Now, Moses is watching an Egyptian guy just beating, smashing the nose and spattering the blood of one of his fellow Hebrews. This is a Hebrew who's already being worked to the bone. And Moses got to a point he just couldn't take it anymore. The sights and the sounds and the splattering blood was too much, and something snapped inside of him. Verse 12 in Exodus 2 says, glancing this way and that, he came to the defense of his countrymen. He just had to. Pulls the Egyptian off the Hebrew guy, and of course then they start fighting, and Moses winds up killing that Egyptian, and he buried him in the sand. The scriptures go on to say the very next day, Moses goes out and he's looking at his people being oppressed again. And this day he sees two Hebrews beating each other up. Same sounds. Same sights. The smashing of teeth and the splattering of blood. And he breaks the fight up and he says, why? Why are you beating a fellow Hebrew? What are you thinking? Our people are in forced labor. We get beat by Egyptians every day. That's bad enough. Don't fight with each other. And I think Moses just saw all the oppression and the frustration of the Hebrew people. And it took him to the absolute edge of his emotional limits, where he thinks, I just can't stand this anymore. It's all madness. Now fast forward a few frames to the famous burning bush story, which is recorded in Exodus 3. You all know it. Moses comes to a bush that's on fire. It just doesn't get consumed. And at that bush, he hears the voice of God call his name. And God tells him to take off his sandals because he's standing on what? Holy ground. And as a kid in Sunday school, I used to have the impression that it was the shock and awe of that burning bush that scared Moses into leadership. But upon further reflection in more recent days, the burning bush, in my opinion, was just an attention grabber. It was just enough to slow Moses down long enough to hear what God had to say. Exodus 3 verse 7. Moses, get these words now. God, I have seen the misery of the people in Egypt. Seen the misery of the Israelites in Egypt. I have heard the sounds. I've heard them crying out. And I'm concerned about their suffering, and I'm going to rescue them. And I'm going to use you to do it. Now, fellow leaders, please get this if you get nothing else from this session. I think what's really happening here is God is saying, Moses, what you saw that day that made you so unbelievably angry, what you saw when the Egyptian guy was beating the living daylights out of that Hebrew slave, what you saw and heard when the two Hebrew guys were so frustrated and angry and hopeless about their situation that they started beating each other up, what you have been seeing, I have been seeing, I have been hearing, I have been watching, and I can't stand it anymore either. And I'm stirred in my spirit, and I'm going to do something from heaven, and I'm going to assign you to be my emissary on earth. And I'm choosing you in part because I see you're stirred in spirit about the same thing that's stirring me. I see a passion in you for your people. I see your emotion. I see a man who can't stand idly by when his people are oppressed and beaten up. I see what it does to you inside, Moses. I see your capacity for activism. I've been looking for that. I've been looking all over, and I have found the man I want. I'm going to harness that internal firestorm of frustration that's raging in you, and I'm going to harness that and use it in a positive way to set my people free. That furnace of frustration is going to forge leadership, mettle, and fortitude in you, and I'm going to use that. This is key to understanding leadership, in my humble opinion. God's heart and a human heart being aligned perfectly around what frustrates heaven and earth. What frustrates the character and nature of God, and what frustrates a potential leader to the point of absolute angst. Now, let me take a time out and come at this from a whole different angle. My generation here in the United States, we all grew up watching a cartoon character called Popeye. And when we were growing up, we all watched on Saturday morning this cartoon about Popeye the Sailor Man. And he had a girlfriend. And his girlfriend's name was Olive Oyl. Olive Oyl. I am interested how the translators are going to handle that. Now, Olive Oyl was a real traffic stopper. Men whistled and dogs barked when she walked by. And whenever anyone or anything would threaten the well-being of Olive Oyl, Popeye would be easygoing about it at first, but then if things began to look ominous, if it looked like something terrible might befall his beloved Olive Oyl, Popeye, the Sailor Man, would feel his blood pressure rising and his pulse racing, and it would go from one level to the next, and then he would say the words that a whole generation of Americans had burned into their psyche. That's all I can stand. Say the rest with me. I can't stand no more. Dubious grammar, I know. But he was a sailor man. That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more. And he would pop open a can of what? Spinach. And supernatural strength would flow into his body, mostly where? His biceps, yeah. And he was anatomically improbable in the cartoon. But at that point where that supernatural strength came into his biceps, he was unstoppable. He would crush the opposition and save Olive Oyl from her distress. What a show that was. But that line, that single line, that's all I can stand, I can't stand no more. That means something to those of us in leadership. It means something to us at a profound level. It was probably something that we saw that we couldn't stand no more, that first prompted us to get off our backsides and move toward the achieving of something worthwhile with our lives. When Moses couldn't stand seeing fellow Hebrews being oppressed and beaten, when he couldn't stand it, he was open and ready. And when God tapped him at the burning bush and said, I will use you, he said, then use me. What can't you stand? What is it that you can't stand? What that is often creates the tension, the angst, the frustration, the internal firestorm in you, the capacity for activism that God speaks to you about someday that launches you into leadership. I'm calling it these days your holy discontent. What is your holy discontent?